Hello and welcome to the 7th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Leah Langby with the IFLIS Library System, and I'm moderating the Youth Services track. Assisting me today is Joy Schwartz with the Winnifox Library System, and we're glad to have you here today. Our presenter for this session is Jessica Ann Bratt with the Grand Rapids Public Library, and she will be talking about race in Storytimes. Jessica, you can begin whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about race in Storytimes. My name is Jessica Ann Bratt, and I'm a professional librarian. I'm also an African-American or Black librarian, and I truly believe that the celebration of diversity and inclusion starts at birth. If we are here in the library profession to foster curiosity and lifelong learning and encourage a sense of self-worth in our children, that's through celebrating our differences, embracing our shameful past, and just uplifting a new narrative of a shared history across multiple cultures. So a little bit about me. So I grew up on the south side of Chicago during the 90s, where it was called the Rust Belt because all the factory jobs were starting to leave. There was extreme urban poverty and social economic segregation and white flight. My parents had kids later in life, so they worked really hard to break into what they thought when they bought their house in '70 as like the creme de la creme of houses. And then they watched neighbor after neighbor, white neighbor after neighbor leave. When they were like the first Blacks to be able to move into that area. And so I always grew up with this really rich sense of history. We had a historian in our family that did this arduous trek of researching our history. So I grew up knowing that my great-great-great-grandmother was born in 1796. She was separated from her parents at birth and sold to the Liddell family in Jackson County, Georgia. And that from that and through all that, this is on my father's side, after they were free, they moved to Mississippi. And my great-great-grandfather was the only Black man in the county to own land and enabled his kids to participate in the Great Migration for multiple reasons. But my dad and also my mom left the South, Mississippi, to go up north. They were the first people in their family to graduate from college. If you read the Isabel Wilkerson book, The Warmth of Other Suns, that is at the heart of their story. They met at those socials where they would make sure different people that came from the South, especially in college, were able to be reunited with other people from that same area. And it was super interesting to have this sort of like duality and knowing like your family's history, and then knowing that you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have any access to resources, but you go to a school in the suburbs where people have access and are affluent and have all these resources. And you know as a kid, like there's something fishy going on, but you don't have any of the knowledge or the world experience to put it all together. And so while my mom, they were dedicated to living in that neighborhood, she knew that our local neighborhood library wasn't always going to have books that featured us. So she made sure she drove to different regional areas of the city where they had a bigger children's book section so we could check out books that featured us. And I just remember growing up all the times that she would let me know when we would go to story times that the librarian wouldn't necessarily read stories that featured us. And that don't expect to see yourself in those stories. They will read different stories that you'll enjoy, but her job was to, as a parent, was to make sure we grew up with this, this affirming identity. So the number one question I get all the time is, why is this so important? Why should we talk about race, or why should others care about talking about race? And so I just wanted to show how race is is so connected, and it's a nuanced topic, but it's so interconnected now. Like in my family, I have a Mexican American cousin. I have mixed cousins of Asian descent and Asian American descent. The baby smiling at the top is my son Everett, and his dad is Dutch. A Dutch American, and we have a little biracial baby, and he has a cousin on the opposite side with my sister-in-law, the one smiling at her pudding, who has all of these observations and questions about race. And he goes to a daycare, the little girl in the middle, and I have permission to share stories. Her mother is Mexican, her father is Black, and she was super excited because her mother just had twins that she did not know what type of skin tone colors her little twin brother and sister were going to come out, and she was like super excited to guess about this, about what they would look like. And it's fun to see them try to process the world around them, but in that same vein, they also are told constantly through lack of representation in schools and library spaces, oftentimes, that they don't fit in and that they don't belong, and why are they so different? How come their parents don't match? So I always feel like the canaries in the coal mine are like biracial children, where they realize like race relations are poisonous and there's something wrong with them. That's what they internalize because they don't belong anywhere. They don't fit in. And so I love like Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, because of course we're not at apartheid status, but he talked about how different people from South Africa went to America and other countries and studied about their race relations and like just perfected it. And so we have these strong stances where we weaponize race and politicize it. And we believe that if we don't talk about it, if we code it in layers, you know, and if people think that if you're called a racist, you want to eradicate or, you know, you, racists are monsters driven to extremisms and do hate crimes, that people don't have a personal responsibility to have any type of solidarity or combat racism or examine their own bias. So I always feel like if we don't offer a new path of teaching, or I like to call it modeling love and inclusion, how can we equip, or how can we have the tools and equip the next generation to overcome their fears and biases? How can we encourage children to be curious and open and accepting if we're not? If we're raising the next generation of lawmakers, of police officers, of just good citizens, decent citizens, how can we help not just expose them to others, but actively combat stereotypes, narrow worldviews, microaggressions, and micro inequities? I love movies, and so I know like Belle, not the Beauty and the Beast, but the Dido Belle movie, when he is asked, the main love interest, about why is it so important about Belle not fitting in, even though she's not a slave, but she doesn't have equal rights. Where he was saying it is about all of us, it's about everything that is important. And so race is important because it is about all of us, whether we think it directly affects us or not. So before I get into the meat of the presentation, I always like to take time to address some things that have cropped up over these trainings. I am into care giving. Caretaking is very self-centered. I'm here to help steer you on the path of exploring more about race and bringing a natural way to engage in race discussions, age-appropriate race discussions to your community. But part of that is you taking on the responsibility to do the work and figure out what you don't know, what your blind spots are, how can you learn more. There's this really great YouTube video from Rachel from Demos. It's called What Does It Take to Be a Good American? And it's about a man who had the self-awareness to know that he was afraid of Black people. And so he called into this like CNN thing to let her know that he has a fear and he doesn't know how to get over that fear. And he had the courage to admit that he had biases and prejudice against Black people. And so she, the way she composes herself and gives him this amazing answer to like, stop watching the news, immerse yourself into actually getting to know other people, read and learn to open yourself up to different experiences. She gave him the tools to combat his own biases. I thought that was like beautiful and epic. So my job is to help support you to figure out what your biases are and what ignorance you may have around race. And I feel like it's up to you to do that work. So people have a lot of feels around race, and I can't always fight your battles. I can help give you the tools so that you can engage. But I just want to remind, if you are getting into a social platform battle about people's views around race and story times, please don't tag me in it and be like, hey, can you go like solve this problem? So I just wanted to put that out there. And then, so I want you to actually like lean if something in this conversation makes you uncomfortable. Race is very nuanced, so please take a deeper analysis or take some breathing room if it makes you uncomfortable, and then engage with it and keep wrestling and opening yourself up to a whole new world if it is, especially about including it in your story times. Oppression is real. Just putting that out there. I went to a workshop where they were like, we're not going to debate this. If you were young, raise your hand if someone ever told you that like you can't do this, or like they don't want to hear from you because you're young, or they don't respect you because you don't know anything. And everyone raised their hand and they're like, welcome to oppression. So there are many great articles and resources where you can take a different look at how that affects marginalized communities, but it is a thing. And then last but not least, in supporting each other. There was a New York Times article called Fighting Erasure, and they have this really great quote about with white people unpacking privilege and challenging each other in those conversations. And the quote was, to engage with the lives of others, white audiences would have to encounter something far more frightening, their irrelevance. They would have to reckon with the fact that the work will not always speak to them, orient them, flatter them with tales of their munificence or infamy, or comfort them with stereotypes. If there is an opposite of erasure, it is allowing for full personhood in all of its idiosyncrasies. So there is room at the table for representation for everybody. And so it's going to take all of us. It's going to take allyship when there is a camera on you and when you aren't getting when no one knows about the good that you're doing in the world. So I just wanted to put that out there before we dive into the presentation. So one of the biggest things around race and the impact that we have in story time is around cultural identity. And so cultural identity gives kids a sense of belonging. It encourages positive self-esteem. And if they realize that they do not fit in, they reject their culture. And so if you think about like huge atrocities committed throughout history, you think about the First Nations having to colonize the schools that they were made to go to, letting them know that their religion was not a religion, like cutting of the hair and having to take on a name opposite of what they were given at birth. Or you think about even the Aboriginal people in Australia and everything that was committed against them. And on a smaller scale, I think about when my parents put us in a predominantly white school growing up, that like I came back, I didn't want to eat greens and sweet potato and cornbread because I thought it was weird and that wasn't what any of the kids were doing. And if I told them this is what I had for dinner, it was just like, that's super weird. We don't eat that. And then I also realized like my parents put all this time and effort into making sure that when they knew at school I was going to be educated, it would start at slavery. And so they wanted to make sure that Black people that I was introduced to made their mark upon civilization and their achievements long before we get into slavery, and before all of the stuff with colonialization. And so again, I'm speaking strictly from a Black experience, but I look at how kids see themselves in history when they're introduced to themselves in history. Are they seeing white male achievements throughout the whole course of history and being told that that's it? You know, that women never contributed anything if we go on the gender and that intersectionality. You know, for example, is there only one type of cowboy, and then there might be like a half a sentence about something else, and then it goes into more like white achievements, that, you know, are the Japanese only having a strong presence in America during internment camps. And this is what goes into like with themed months. So I get a lot of story times where it's like, well, we'll read about Latinx and Hispanic culture during like September, or, you know, Native American culture, you know, doing this month. And I'm not saying that you can't celebrate those months, but actively seeking a diverse representation throughout your sessions, themed and unthemed, is what I'm trying to encourage. Because I feel like a lot of times while my parents and I know multiple other people of color, they take their kids to story times for that whole early childhood education, they have to do additional work because they know that that cultural identity is tied into seeing themselves celebrated and affirming their differences in a healthy way. I also feel like on the opposite end, for kids never having to struggle with that, you build up all these biases that we'll talk about later, into thinking that your worldview and your experience is the only and the right experience because that's all that you see and know. And we're going to get into sort of the history of what happens when people of color see a lack of representation and affirmation. And so there are better tests nowadays. Harvard has developed the project Implicit Bias, where there have been numerous studies from race to age and gender. My parents graduated in the 68 in high school, so they were around the time when the Brown versus Board was huge. And so when my mom was studying, and the dad will mention, the doll test was like infamous, and that was like the cutting edge in their school about the detrimental effects of segregation. And so there's documentaries, Eyes on the Prize, and various others that do a really good look at understanding the psychological effects that segregation had on both Black and white children. And so going into workshops and life experience and having numerous friends of color, we have these stories that are like super formulaic at this point. We've all been affected by this insidious silence of not talking about race from birth. And then you sort of enter this thing now that's amazing, especially in movies and pop culture, where representation is slowly starting to trickle down, where you have movies like the Black Panther or Into the Spider-Verse, where you get these rich and complex stories, but there's room at the table again for everyone. And I feel like what's been interesting about the people of color that have been privileged enough to travel outside of the United States was when we all discuss about having experiences where we finally feel American, when we go outside, where we actually get to see like, oh, this is what it means to be American, where when we are living at home, you get othered so much. For example, when I went to Idaho to do some work, I got asked questions by the town we were in, like, what are you doing here? Like, why are you here? Are you the stereotypes from, are you a wedding singer? Are you like all this other stuff where you're like, I am in the United States of America. And I, you know, like, you've never met a Black person before. I know we're 12%, but it's just super, super interesting of like into your nation or being there and being othered. So what does this have to do with librarianship? So we are before the birth period, and we have this immense power to help prepare people as their kids go into preschool and kindergarten. So we had a lady who wrote into our contact form about how we equipped her daughter with all of the confidence to thrive in preschool socially. And I feel as librarians, we have this social, emotional intelligence component that we can help equip our kids for when they grow up interacting with others. And I was part of this race and age exercise workshop, and they had everyone in the class of all races. It was a very diverse group, right on when they realized what race they were and what was one word about to describe that experience. And so then we were all lined up in order from birth to college. And so every single person in the workshop that was of color, we were all in the 0 to 5 side of the room. And then all of the white people were all like high school and college. And so they were all talking about how they remembered during classes and stuff like that, where they were learning about how they fit into the world and the identity that they take with them, and all of the connotations with that. And all of the people of color, we all had this, like, if I could say, just shocking experience. It was mostly not normal. And had very much layers around being found out you're whatever race. And so mine was when I was in kindergarten and I found out that I was Black because no one came to my birthday party because I lived in a bad neighborhood. And even though I woke up every day and was like, I get dressed and I don't see gangs or violence, like my Black is great. We know all the people on there. I remember telling my mom, like, I just didn't understand. What does it mean we live in a bad neighborhood? And my mom gripping the steering wheel, being like, well, it's predominantly Black, and how do I put that, people are afraid of Black people, so they're not going to come here. And so it just like blew my mind. And so I feel like as a professional, you have this amazing responsibility that you can help properly model to parents, just like we do with like literacy and like parent tips on how to help your kid be an independent reader. So we can create these inclusive environments where we're fostering appropriately aged dialogue about our humanity and like legit science. Like skin pigment isn't a magical thing that happens. And we should be celebrating those differences. So when kids are school age and they are curious, that they aren't immediately shut down or, unintentionally hurt someone's feelings because their takeaway is like, I'm just repeating what all the adults in my life I've overheard them say. Or, I've seen my parents like have a very uncomfortable reaction in public, or they've shut me down and told me that, this isn't something we can talk about. And so over my course of of observing people and reading stuff about race, I feel like there's usually this 2-race model that parents wrestle with. And so on some hand, I always call it osmosis. You have some parents who are like, I'm going to surround my kid with diversity and they'll just know everything about avoiding microaggressions. They'll be culturally competent. They'll be world leaders, but never ever have a conversation about what their kids are internalizing, what they're processing, what they're thinking even with that osmosis model. And then the avoider is the other model I've seen, where I have parents who are like, I'm protecting my child's innocence. Everything is politicized, is like a heavily used word nowadays. And so we just don't talk about it because I just want my kid to remain a kid. And so I had a staff member who allowed me to share this story about how they nannied and their parents let them know that their kids were starting to have these observations and ask questions, but she couldn't talk about race no matter what the kids asked. And so she was in a coffee shop and the kids pointed out the brown and Black skinned people, and they immediately just started discussing how they thought it was like the intensity and like being sunburned. And she had to sit there and say, like, there is just some powerful ignorance that these kids are coming to their conclusion because their parents don't want to have like a proactive talk with them around race. And so then she made the decision that she would have to talk to the parents because she just didn't want the kids growing up believing. And having this ignorance with them. So I am encouraging you that even in your story times, one of the huge responsibilities we have are challenge stereotypes. And just like you would challenge gender stereotypes, women can do what men do, like race should be the same way. How are you portraying Native Americans who are still around? Like, it just amazes me with kids who have just been sold that like they are no more. Are you just reading books where they're just portrayed in a certain age? Blacks are just more than entertainers, musicians, and civil rights activists. Are you also showing stories to feature them as regular kids like Jabari Jumps or Max and the Tagalong Moon or I Got Rhythm, where it's that Twitter hashtag of like carefree black girl, a carefree black boy, or black girl magic, so on and so forth. And a part of learning how to talk about race in story time is how you model. We talk about Storytime Transitions. We talk about how a lot of times people have a practical tip for parents and caretakers to learn about reading and raising readers. And so in order to raise socially conscious kids, good citizens, or empathetic people, you do it in the same way. You can bring up these points naturally in a non-checklist way, or the non like, oh, I'm doing my good deed of the Storytime universe, or I'm doing my good Storytime universe deed. And it shouldn't also feel like, oh my God, they're making us do another thing. This isn't something that's detracting from story time at all, where you're going over and beyond to show that you're modeling inclusion. Again, I'm a Black librarian and haven't missed a beat when pointing out features to kids, and I've observed my librarians and library assistants do it too. I actually had a librarian this past session come into my room being like, the most amazing thing happened. And she talked about how she had been very nervous about actually doing Let's Talk About Race in her story time. But she, powered through it and got her parent tip, and she had a very diverse audience of families of color. And she watched all of the families of color when she was getting into her story time tip 10. And I was like, before she could finish, I was like, yeah, they thought you were going to say something stupid. And she's like, I know. And then she was like, I said what I was supposed to say. And then she like watched them relax and just be like, okay. And then she said that dynamic of the story time completely changed, where they were open and they were like a little family at the end of her session. And she was like having a conversation around the families of color that were so appreciative that the library had a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was like, yes, the biggest thing is overcoming that fear that it is possible that like, because of, we know 9 times out of 10 people say dumb things, we're going to be like, oh no, I'm going to have to protect my kid from like them saying something stupid or doing something stupid, or I'm going to have this huge conversation around race because someone butchered it. But I'm telling you that we do set you up for success, that these tips aren't anything that like people get mad about, and they really do appreciate that it is okay to see that the library wants to represent all facets of a very multifaceted community. And so I'm going to breeze through this a little bit because hopefully these are some things that you can do on your own time to before you dive into the toolkit, to take a minute to figure out what you do as a librarian in your practices for storytime books. And how many of them are diverse, how many of them are purely animals, how many of them feature white children. Do you ever compare best lists of books with a diversity lens? And then how often are you willing to actually try out what you read about? Do you share any of knowledge with your coworkers and manager around diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I hope that you can take the time to thoughtfully answer these questions, because we all have room to grow, and that there's power in acknowledging where your room for growth is and overcoming that fear that something crazy bad is going to happen if I take this risk or I take this chance to talk about race. And, you know, fear is one of the worst motivators because it's so paralyzing. And so instead of using that as a motivator to not do this, I want you guys to really realize that like you can overcome that fear and achieve some like results. Because if we're gonna have racial harmony in society, one of the things you have to truly believe is that you have a personal and professional responsibility, that you can make story times fun and affirming. And if you've never had to be conscious about race, you can do it in a positive and meaningful way to give the next generation of health professionals or police officers the tools to like overcome that bias. And I do it all the time, like those indestructible books. My son has one that's called Let's Eat, and my niece was pointing out the little boy on the front of Let's Eat, and I was asking her, is her skin tone color lighter or darker? Does it look like her cousin? And so you can have like super age appropriate where they're just like, oh, okay, we're all born, we all look the same on the inside, but we're born with different skin colors on the outside. That's great. And then they go about their business. And so part of getting into all of the handouts that are available, I think on the session as well as online, is having those example parent tips that you can practice to let people know and let children know that we're just all born with different skin tone colors, and then letting them know that their kids are going to say super crazy things, and that there are good questions and good answers if you don't know as a parent, or if this is really hard for you to engage with, that you can have some great starts and then circle back and follow up. We have this program called Social Justice Begins With Me from 4 to 11, and there are different breakout groups, and we have like a hot topic, whether it's refugee and immigration, gender equity, but we have questions where kids are allowed like a safe space, so that they can the parent can hear how their kid is processing around them. And it's always amazing to see all of the parents' reactions. And so one thing we had to start encouraging, because parents want to police like other kids' thoughts, is like, that's not our job. Our job is like, you as a parent, if you're mortified that your kid said something that you're just like, where did they learn that from? Is to help follow up and like engage in those conversations. Because then when you get older, it's about taking that fear away when it does become like super complicated and super nuanced around consent and you know, sexual harassment, that you have built this foundation where you can engage with your kid in appropriate dialogue around these topics. And so we, again, start with like a lot of times parents think we're gonna like talk about these like really difficult, like enraging, depending on their feelings, about things about race. And it's like, nope, you know, that is for when they're in high school. Again, we're just helping them get the tools to start processing the world around them where it isn't seated in fear mongering and just stereotypes. So I like to use different books for modeling race. That I'm just giving quick examples. There are more on the handout. I do feel that a lot of people, depending on their limited interactions with African-American kids, age them up a lot of times. And so my people, I like as a starting point to show how just all different Black people look at all varying ages, and doing some facilitating dialogue around that. I like Baby and Me, and making sure that parents don't ignore the brown part. And I also love like These Hands, and the fact that like kids understand fair and unfair, and you can use feelings around books that like, you know, I am, you know, very upset that this happened to this group of people at this time. But again, you can just simplify concepts that they know that, hey, this happened in America, and it was really terrible for this group of people, and it was unfair, and kids get that. And so you can look through that, and there's some other stuff of story of like where you would fit it in your lesson planning for story times and stuff like that. So a lot of times it's how do you get the buy-in from staff and management? And you don't have to be the head of youth services to get your head of youth services on board. I am now the head of youth services, but I was not then when I developed Let's Talk About Race. I was just a Storytime instructor who had just gotten a job as a branch manager. And so I sat down with the head of YS at the time, and I presented the tools that I developed. I gave her documentation and asked her to come out and observe a session that I had done, so that she can see for herself if she feels like this would work or not. And then from there, we made a plan to get our Storytime instructors on board. And so we had a mixed bag of librarians. Some were super receptive and on board with change, and then others, it takes a while for change to happen. Like, I'm saying this in all sarcasm, but they'll be like, progress is slow, and that, like, freedom took time, and you're just like, wow, this is insane. But you're going to get a mixed pot of reactions. So the first thing is have those numerous meetings. And so if they always say at my library that youth services had lots of fields. So I made sure that I got all of those fields out. So you can find out where everyone stands, even if it's hurtful or you feel like people are just saying unhelpful things. You have to divorce yourself from a lot of people's first innate reactions and think about the big picture, because you want people to listen to you. So you want to make sure that they feel listened and heard about all of their feelings surrounding about race. So you talk out their concerns about their awkward feelings, about microaggressions, about racial terminology, and if your institution has moved from, we made a move from saying Latinx instead of Hispanic. So is your staff aware of the institutional changes? So, you get it out in a judgment-free zone. This is a great time for you yourself to practice not being biased at your coworkers, because you're trying to achieve a higher goal. And then you stress the first word, which is practice. You practice the flow, what they will say, how they will say it, give them examples, model those examples. Tone, I can always call out if someone is not buying what they're selling. If I know that they think this is just an exercise or some diversity training, they don't really believe in it, your Storytime community will not believe in it either. And so you want to reassure everyone by developing some institutional support language. So, sort of like the go-to phrase. A lot of people fear that if something wrong happens, if someone says something, they're going to get fired. If they say the wrong thing, if someone calls them out about how they talk about race, they're going to get in trouble. So we had to do a lot of talks about reensuring that our institution supports them. And then we even made celebrating diversity, inclusion, and equity talking points that I'll get to in a few minutes around, if you do have people that are concerned about what you're saying. And then the best thing is, and I'm showing you just a preview of the handout, and just some entry parts and talking about race. But in order for this to get off the ground in your story time, for your Storytime librarians, is having tangible next step. Because you can have all the materials, you can present the materials, but you have to have goals and steps to help move people forward. So for people that this is brand new to, the first thing we have them do is highlight authors and illustrators of color, because I did many story times where people were not aware of all of the diverse picture book representation from authors and illustrators. So if there are award-winning books, I would talk about what the award is. Like Jerry Pinkney, is African-American who won the Coretta Scott King. I think it's Jason Chen who wrote Gravity, if we did a STEAM time. And, and I talked about the Asian-American picture books and authors and illustrators. So it was mandatory that our Storytime instructors introduce their story times. Like you can set a limit on depending on how long the Storytime sessions are. Like ours last anywhere from 10 to 12 weeks. So we would say that at least 3 to 4 books need to reflect some type of diverse author and illustrator, and then making sure that they highlight that. And then we started then again with just focusing on one session. So we started with baby time first, that one of the instructors would use one of our let's talk about race tips. And so we have 8 locations. So I'm constantly going out now as the head of youth services to observe, to talk to people, and made a guide for people in the branches who have to train new hires about talking about race and how to coach people through any of their feelings of being awkward. Or you know, just practicing, because this isn't something, if you haven't had to do it before, that you can just do off cuff. So just like you would practice your singing and your rhymes, that those transitions and that let's talk about tip needs to be practiced as well. Sorry about this. So there are all, again, reiterating, there are all of these sheets, including like a microaggression sheet if you're having trouble talking through that with staff, book lists of recommended books, baby, toddler, and preschool lesson plan examples, and then all of the clothesline or parent tips can be printed out if you do the clothesline and on 8x11 or cardstock. And again, when the biggest fear is like, what if I say something wrong and then a caretaker calls me out on what I've said, what I've read, and you know, it makes it all weird. So I live in a Dutch Christian Reformed population. When I moved to Grand Rapids out of library school to Chicago, it was a bit of a culture shock about the lack of diversity. And so it has been fun to me and a great challenge to create advocacy around celebrating diversity, inclusion, and equity. And part of it is our city as a whole, which has been amazing, has this commitment. And they asked all of the departments that within our budgets, we have to prove how we are actually going forward and in our diversity, inclusion, and equity work. So we have developed, especially when we started Social Justice Begins With Me, with that book club, making sure that as we embark on this journey, that we had people were prepared to deal with upset patrons. And so I've included a handout where, like, again, we encourage, like, you don't have to take verbal abuse from anyone, but you can say in a calm tone, you know, I won't be able to help you if you continue to speak to me that way. You can affirm how they're feeling, that you know that they're upset about this. And, you know we don't have things that might be for every family, but, you know, it's up to the parent to decide what is appropriate. And then we also let them know for our advocacy phrases, we want children to become comfortable working, living, and communing alongside people who look different from themselves. Or, you know, our city has made a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as a part of our city and community, it's important to us to celebrate and affirm children of their differences. If people do, and come at me with a nuance about race, and it has not happened. It's happened about actually like older kids in middle grade than like little kids. But with middle grade, it's sort of like, this is a conversation to be held at dinner or something around race that is not like, I'm not going to get anywhere in a 5-minute conversation, but I will happily follow up with you if you want to discuss this in a longer conversation. And with like middle grade, it was mostly around, we were doing One Book, One City, and we picked the book One Crazy Summer. And so that was a lot of fun with people who have strong feelings around race and the Black Panthers. And it was great. It was a lot of fun. And so to wrap up, so we have time for questions. Just to make sure that when you are dealing with caretakers, if your library has inclusion and diversity policy or collection policy, you can use that. And then again, I always say you remind them that you've picked out age appropriate books, and that it's completely appropriate to use this for those ages. And then I sometimes I'll be very frank, and that if someone is upset, I'm not talking about the nuances of slavery and the violation of physical bodies and rape and assault. Like, you can read the room. You don't have to like go to 10 if they're only at a 3. And then you can bring it back that, again, you're reiterating that you're discussing age appropriate material. And so we started it with Let's Talk About Race, and then I partnered with a social worker from our local university, Grand Valley State University, to bring in this book club where every month there's a social justice theme for 4 to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 to 11. They read a book and then they facilitate a discussion, and we make sure the volunteers who are reading the book match whatever topic. So if it's refugee and immigration, if it's ableism and disability, our next coming up topics will be on like hunger and poverty, and on mental health and neurodiversity. Like, we make sure that we're finding people that are representative of the community. And so sort of like Let's Talk About Race helped make the way to make sure that we are bringing an inclusive representation of our community. And we've seen that with the people who have thanked us and have make sure that their kids are always there. And I always feel like the kids will be all right. We had like 100+ people. It restored a lot of people's humanity. So I feel like you can take risks on amazing programs like this and make sure that you have built all of the bones in advocacy, and let it take off on fire in the community. So I hope that from this talk you can take away that we have the ability to be a better society. Fred Hampton said we can fight racism, not with racism, but with solidarity. The work you do in Storytime can be and is solidarity work. Part of that work is figuring out that solidarity work is how to disrupt biases. And so I hope you take these tools to do exactly that. And Alex Haley said that racism is taught and not an automatic behavior. And so if this is taught in our society and it's not automatic, it's a learned behavior towards people with dissimilar physical characteristics, we can help combat that. Because you're empowering families and children that they don't have to automatically learn to embrace ignorance and fear. And so my favorite quote is from Audre Lorde, which is, "It is not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." So I hope as you go forth in your story times that you can celebrate all of those differences that make up our very wonderful communities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we did have a question here. Oh wait, was that your finishing?
Oh, sorry, I forgot. I had sources, tons of sources, super simplified, and just if you do need any questions, there it is. So yes, I am done.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to leap in on you there.
No worries.
Okay, so just to reiterate, we had a question about where the sample tips are, and they are, the toolkit is available, will be available on the website by Friday, but also if you go into the handout section of GoToWebinar, which I have not used very much before, so I'm hoping that this works for everyone. You should be able to find those. Sorry for the echoing, if that's happening for everyone. Also, we had a question about the video you referenced at the very beginning about what does it mean, what does it take to be a good American? If you, I tried to kind of scrounge around and look for that, but I didn't come up with it.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, so if you can send that to me, I can share it with folks afterwards.
Perfect. I would love to. It has a really sweet story. He started a Twitter account and started reading all this stuff, and a lot of friends, he talks about all his friends that were mad at him, but they have this cute little relationship after, like, behind the scenes. It's a fascinating, lovable story, but I'll make sure I send that video.
Wonderful, thank you. One thing that I was wondering is, you were talking about just making it like, if you have an 11 to 12 week session, you require that at least 3 to 4 books need to be by a diverse author or illustrator. And I wanted a clarification on that. Did you mean per story time, or per sometime in that 12 weeks you should at least have that many, or?
Yeah, so to clarify, so if we do a 10-week session, my ultimate goal is, whether it's themed or unthemed, half the books should be diverse representation. But to start people somewhere, and I forgot to mention this with the overhaul we did on all of our Storytime resources, I gave them the challenge that whether it's themed or unthemed, during a 10 to 12 week session, there should at least be 3 books where they're highlighting a person of color, author, or illustrator. So if I hope that is like a little bit of clarity. And I didn't say like how often, but at least 3 over the course of the session. And then we overhauled all of our, like, we had rotating bends and story time bends. So one of the things is we made sure that we bought and built up a shared Storytime collection, so people can make sure that there are books to look and browse and find for diverse representation. Excellent.
And so yes, your idea was 3 to 4 would be the absolute minimum. Your goal is to have significantly more than that. Yep, that makes sense. Okay. Let me see here. I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Another just thing that I definitely noticed and wanted to just amplify was your slide about the natural, like, it's, just include this in your natural flow, but don't wait until you're not nervous or you're not feeling awkward. You have to start. You can't just like wait until you're magically feeling fine about it all. So
and you'll never be. I hear from librarians in the moment that they like open up their mouth and they're just like, oh no, how's this gonna go? And so it's that thing that you can fight through that fear to get to the other side, and then you have one down, and then you can be like, okay, that didn't go so bad. And then I feel like to make it effortless, or to feel effortless, you have to start. It takes some effort to get to that point.
Yep. And then we did have someone just clarifying the book. I'm sorry. There are book suggestions, quite a few book suggestions in the handouts in the toolkit that are part of the handouts and will also be on the website.
Correct. So I just gave you like one example for baby, one example for toddler, one example for preschool, but there are more. And every year as there are more books published, like one of my favorites right now that was published that just shows everyone was ta-da. And so you make sure like it's a couple years old, but again, this is just supposed to start you off on your journey, and just say that you can find appropriate read alouds for every age group. So you'll see a few for each one, and sort of a synopsis around why it's good for this age, with the encouragement, hopefully, that you will keep pursuing others.
Excellent. Wonderful, wonderful. And yes, so we got that. And if you have any other questions, please type them in right now while you're answering this last question that we're asking to everyone. We have time. Can you talk a little bit about something that you're excited about related to libraries right now in this moment?
Oh man, there's so many things. I feel like Find Free is huge and trending, and I think we have this exciting future to reimagine people's jobs. I feel like people get caught up like, what am I gonna do if we go Find Free? And it's like, no, this is super cool to help reduce barriers to access. So I'm really excited about the future. And then social services is a growing trend in libraries. To help us with support and to make sure that we're addressing the most vulnerable in the community. So I think that that has so much potential to grow in libraries. And we're re-envisioning our space right now and figuring out how to change it to make it flexible for non-traditional library patrons. So I feel like a lot of times we go to the table and we're like, we want to address this certain segment of society. And then when they come in the library, we get mad because they're not like our traditional behaved patrons. So I love the challenge of like, so how do we get a space to make sure that they feel welcome? And what does that look like? So I'm really excited to, as we're off on the pursuit of all of those different things, to make sure that we're able to not just have everyone come into our doors, but try to meet everyone's need that visits the library. So I think there's like some exciting things, whether and also like on the nerdy standpoint, virtual reality is like super huge, and augmented reality. So I feel like the future of libraries is so bright, and so I get really jazzed about all the different exciting things that libraries are on the verge of trying and risking to show how needed we are as an equalizer within our communities.
Yay! That was inspiring. Okay. We did have one other question come in. You mentioned that all city departments in Grand Rapids have to show what they are doing to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
Part of their. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that's?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, because we were like switching directors, and so it got tasked. Decided to help out this year because we were in transition of a nationwide search when it was doing it. But so our library, or I should say, like our city as a whole, has done and made huge strides that they want to not just attract diverse talent, but retain a diverse talent. And then if they're only hitting certain segments of the community, what can they do more, or what aren't they doing? So this has been a like 5-year trying to get everyone sort of to the same shared view of there are just all of these inequities in the city and what we can do to start addressing that. And so one of the things that they mandated, whether it's the Parks Department or the library, is that people are very good at buzzwords and like lip speak, but what exactly are you doing? And so one thing, in order to get budgets approved for departments, is they added EDI component where they wanted you to make sure you have measurable outcomes. And so like our budget, our accountant and human resources, I think last year had to go present while we were in transition. But every year they make sure that we are held accountable in what are we doing to further the cause of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and then how will that be measured, and then reporting back. And so I remember a couple years ago, we talked about what we're doing with our collections. I know local history, which is also housed in like our main, was doing a lot of things in the community to make sure that like a lot of different communities, their contributions weren't valued. So you have heavily skewed and a lot of erasure in the archival work. So they, went and talked about all the stuff that they were doing to bring in like the Latinx and how they have helped change the community since Grand Rapids was founded, and like African Americans, and trying to gather oral history. So and then trickling that down to how we do collections in our development, and how much representation is out on the floor, and all different types of things. And so I remember there was like a pool of ideas, but that's what we sort of we have to prove to the city every year of how we're helping to further the cause of the world, not as it is, but as we want it to be.
Excellent. Great. We did have one last, we just keep having one last one, and I think we have time for, there are a couple of people who are, I guess Amy is just looking through the handouts and is not necessarily finding everything that she's expecting. So I'm just going to encourage you. I'm thinking that if you have some time when you're not trying to listen to the webinar at the same time, that you will find all the, all the things that are referred to, like the microaggressive behaviors handout is probably in there. They're just lumped into two great big PDF files. So I think that if you take the time, have the time to look for them, you will hopefully find them.
Yes, I promise I dumped on them a ton of resources.
Okay. So, and if you're finding that, you're missing after you really diligently look through it all, when you're not trying to also listen to the webinar, if you're not finding it, please let me know, and I will help you track that down. Or you can contact Jessica probably too, if you're really stuck at finding this information. Thank you so much, Jessica Ann, for a great session. As mentioned, this session recording and slides will be posted on the conference website by January 25th, along with the rest of the handouts if you didn't have a chance to get those. Tomorrow, we start again at 9 in the morning with programs in both the marketing and the small and mighty tracks. So I hope that you'll be there with us tomorrow, and if not, I hope you have a great rest of your day today and a terrific rest of your week. Thanks again.